Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you for coming to our event on how to win a referendum on Europe. This event is to mark the publication of Robert Saunders' book called Yes to Europe. If you haven't read it, it's worth reading. Andrew Marr in the New Statesman called it a jaw-dislocating page-turner. Daniel Hannan in The Spectator said it was a captivating read. The review in the Daily Telegraph gave it 5 stars. And Vernon Bogdor in the Times Literary Supplement said it was beautifully written. Obviously, those of us who also publish books that don't enjoy those sort of reviews in no way feel envy or jealousy at the sort of reception that Rob is getting. Gingerhead bastard. We will. Rob is going to start the event giving us a sort of 15-minute trip back in time to 1975. And then after that, we've got a very distinguished panel. Andrew Cooper, Baron Cooper of Windrush, who was pollster for the Remain campaign. Gisela Stewart, who was chair of Vote Leave. Sir Onslow is deputy director of the Institute for Commonwealth Studies. And Stephen Bush is special correspondent at the New Statesman and PSA's Political Studies Association's Journalist of the Year. They're also going to give their comments and insight, and then we'll happily take Q&A from the audience. After all of that, there will be what I normally describe as cheap wine, but recently I saw the bill the catering service send us for these events. So it's the most expensive cheap wine you'll ever try to night, and there will be the chance to buy copies of Rob's book. But with no further ado, Rob, over to you, please.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that very touching introduction. I have to start with a string of thank yous. So first of all, thank you to all of you for being here. It's wonderful to see so many friends and colleagues and students here. It's wonderful how a referendum on Europe can bring people together in this way. I would also like to thank Phil Cowley and the Mile End Institute for hosting this event, and especially for hosting the drinks reception afterwards. If you want to know what British wine is going to taste like after Brexit, if we can't get a good trade deal with the continent, then you're going to find out later this evening. And I think the fact that we've got such a great turnout this evening is really a tribute to the excellence of our 4 speakers. So I particularly want to thank all 4 of our panellists for giving up their time and their expertise to be here this evening. And I'm also very glad that Michael Watson and Chris Burrows are here from Cambridge University Press. And I'm especially grateful to them for taking a punt on this book and for producing such an attractively priced, gift-sized edition. Now, what I want to do for the next few minutes is to take us back in time. So mentally we need to put our flares on and our big hair and go back to the 5th of June 1975, 43 years ago today, the day of Britain's first referendum on leaving Europe. Now, this was the first national referendum in British history, and that means it's an important moment in the constitutional history of Britain, as well as in its relationship with Europe. Now, at the start of 1975, opinion polls suggested that up to 2/3 of the British public wanted to leave. 6 months later, by the time the polls had closed, there had been a total transformation. The result was a landslide, a 2-to-1 majority in favour of staying in. Every part of the United Kingdom, except for Shetland and the Western Isles, voted to stay in. So if we're thinking about how to win a referendum on Europe, this is a dazzlingly successful example. So what I'm going to try and do is give you a brief whistle-stop tour of the campaign. I'll talk about why the referendum happened, how it was fought, and how it was won. So let's start with why it happened. Well, Britain had joined what was then the European Community just 2 years earlier, on the 1st of January 1975, and it joined under the Conservative government of Ted Heath, who didn't usually look this cheerful. But there had always been a question mark over the legitimacy of that decision. There had not been a referendum on entry. It had not particularly been an issue in the previous general election. So when Labour came to power in 1974 under Harold Wilson, a party that was itself bitterly divided on this question, he made the electorate a twofold promise. He would renegotiate the terms of membership and then put them to the public in a referendum. And of course that is exactly the offer that David Cameron would repeat with rather different results. Now, if we could put Harold Wilson in the TARDIS and we could beam him forward to 2016, I think there's quite a lot that he would have found familiar. So, like David Cameron, Harold Wilson was a European with his head rather than his heart. He governed with a wafer-thin parliamentary majority. He led a cabinet that was bitterly divided on the subject of Europe. And he was governing amidst a rising tide of Euroscepticism among the public. And so, like David Cameron, confronted with this fizzing bomb sitting on the cabinet table, he chose to lob it over the fence and ask the electorate to deal with it for him. So there are some points of similarity, but it's the differences, I think, that are much more striking. So in 1975, the most pro-European party was the Conservative Party, under its new leader, Margaret Thatcher, pictured here in her famous Yes to Europe woolly jumper. Now, when she first became leader, there were suspicions that she might not share the Europeanism of her predecessor, but she acted very quickly to stamp that out. So during the campaign, she said Mr. Heath's outstanding achievement was to lead Britain into the European community. This torch must be picked up and carried by whoever is chosen to succeed her. And she took that idea of a torch of European unity very literally. If you'll forgive me for showing you the cover of my book, but if not tonight, when? Here she is at a rally in Parliament Square, literally holding aloft a beacon of European unity. And she's standing in front of the statue of Winston Churchill, the Conservative Prime Minister who first talked about a United States of Europe. The other big speaker at that rally was Harold Macmillan, the Prime Minister who first applied for entry. So this is about visualising the idea of a conservative torch for Europe being handed down from one leader to another. Meanwhile, the Labour Party, and especially the left of the Labour Party, was much more sceptical. Parties like the Scottish National Party and Plaid Cymru also campaigned to leave. So the party politics of this have really swung on a hinge. In the 1970s, the young were more Eurosceptic than the old. Women were more Eurosceptic than men. And the most pro-European part of the UK was undoubtedly England, and particularly the south of England. In fact, if you were a unionist in 1975, the great nightmare was that England would vote to stay in, whereas Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to leave. So the geography of Euroscepticism has turned on its head. So how was this campaign actually fought? Well, as in 2016, there were two official campaigning vehicles. So campaigning to stay in, we've got Britain in Europe. And on the material, you'll see lots of Union Jacks, lots of Welsh dragons, lots of very patriotic imagery. Also quite a lot of poppies as the flower of remembrance. Campaigning to leave, we have the National Referendum campaign, mostly dominated by trade unions, and with this rather peculiar image up here of the British Isles running away in their socks from the continent. Now, right from the beginning, this was a David v Goliath contest. The No campaign spent probably about £150,000, about £150,000. The Yes campaign spent £2 million. It was the largest sum of money ever spent in an election contest to that date. The Yes campaign also had overwhelming support from the media. Papers like The Sun, the Daily Express, the Daily Telegraph, the Daily Mail, all of them campaigned to keep Britain in. In fact, the only national papers that backed a no votes were the Morning Star, which is a communist paper, and the Spectator. The Spectator did produce one of the better cartoons of the campaign, the Brussels mannequin misbehaving on the Union Jack. Britain and Europe could also call on most of the big beasts of British politics. So this is a fairly typical image from a press conference. So Jeremy Thorpe, who's been on our TV screens the last few weeks, the leader of the Liberal Party, hadn't shot any dogs at this point, Ted Heath, the former leader of the Conservative Party, Roy Jenkins, Labour Home Secretary and former Chancellor. We could add to this list people like Shirley Williams, Margaret Thatcher, David Steele, and so on. Now, the No campaign also had some star power. People of the calibre of Tony Benn, Enoch Powell, Barbara Castle and Michael Foot. The problem was that firstly, these were all quite polarising figures. They tended to arouse quite strong emotions in the public, but also that they found it almost impossible to work together. There was nobody on the No campaign that had the kind of cross-party appeal that someone like Boris Johnson still had in 2016. But there was, of course, a danger here for the Remain campaign. If we look back at our press conference, this is a very establishment, very elitist organisation. The 1970s is in many ways a very anti-establishment decade. So the great fear for campaign officials is that there will be a backlash against elites of the kind that we saw in 2016. So how do you guard against this? Well, one thing they did was they tried to keep politicians off the posters. So instead, we got images like these. So we've got the boxer Henry Cooper, don't knock Britain out. The England cricket captain, Colin Cowdrey, don't hit Britain out. All, of course, people who have competed successfully for Britain in the world. Other figures, Marge Proops, the legendary agony aunt of the Daily Mirror. Up here we've got a rather peculiar pantomime cast of figures. Captain Mannering from Dad's Army, Richard Briers from The Good Life, J.B. Priestley, and so on. Now, there was a very serious point to this, which was it was about saying that it's about creating a contrast in the minds of voters. It's about saying all the people that you like and admire want you to stay in. All the people you're slightly afraid of want you to leave. And in that respect, it wasn't especially helpful for the Leave campaign that their supporters included the IRA, the Communist Party, the National Front, and the Reverend Ian Paisley. This is not the fault of the Leave campaign, but it hangs like an albatross around their necks. And it's great hay is made of this by cartoonists, this kind of hairy array of Scottish nationalists and Trotskyites and Maoists trying to march Britain out of the community. Britain and Europe started from the assumption that most people are not particularly interested in European integration. So what it tried to do was find out what people were interested in and make Europe relevant to that. So they created all sorts of bespoke campaign organisations. There was Actors for Europe, or Communists for Europe, Christians for Europe. For one glorious moment before the leadership shut them down, there were Wombles for Europe. There was a very active Women in Europe office, which created material tailored to young women, working mothers, single parents, and so on. There were separate campaigns for Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. So, Andrew may correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I think there is perhaps an interesting difference here from 2016, that the Remain campaign in 2016 had a very strong message discipline. It was going to talk about economic risk and not very much else. In 1975, the Remain campaign consciously chose to be much more diverse. The issues that it engaged with included very big questions like war and peace. 1975 is, of course, only 30 years since the end of the Second World War. And both sides tried to use this to their advantage. So, for some in the Out campaign, joining Europe was a betrayal of the things that people had fought and died to save during the war. This is an unofficial campaign poster. It's produced by a group of Scottish students. But the language of resistance and wartime resistance is quite strong in the Out campaign. The Yes campaign also uses the war, but it focused more on the idea of remembrance, the idea that you honour the sacrifice of those who died by building a peaceful Europe. So you get this line on the left here: better to lose a little national sovereignty than to lose a son or a daughter. That links into another theme, which was Britain's place in the wider world. Britain famously had lost an empire and not yet found a role. The question was whether Britain could find that role in Europe. And we find some surprisingly jingoistic voices making the case for Europe. So the Sun says, after years of drift and failure, the common market offers an opportunity for a nation that lost an empire to gain a continent. The Daily Mail puts it a bit more bluntly, the European community must become the new British Empire. And the idea that Britain should lead in Europe, which we hear so often, has, I think, quite a strong imperial pedigree. But of course, the core of the campaign, as in 2016, was the economy. Would Britain be richer or would it be poorer outside? Now, as in 2016, Leavers made absolutely blood-curdling predictions about what would happen if Britain left. So Ted Heath talked about a return to the ration book. MPs talked about the closing of schools and hospitals, the shutting of mines and railways. They run some quite blunt images like these. You can't take your food for granted any longer. What do you think will happen to your job if we vote to leave? The difference, I think, is that those warnings resonated in the 1970s in a way that they didn't really 2 years ago. And I think that's partly about context. If we think about the 18 months before the referendum in 1975, it had seen the quadrupling of oil prices, inflation at 25%, a 3-day week in industry, rolling power cuts, and all sorts of really devastating economic signs. My favourite illustration of this is that Tony Benn wrote in his diary in December 1974, "The final collapse of capitalism may be only weeks away." Now, this is the Secretary of State for Industry writing about the imminent collapse of capitalism. So the idea that the economy might collapse if Britain gets this decision wrong, I think is much more pernicious in 75 than it did more recently. But another difference, I think, is that those apocalyptic messages are paired with a kind of message of hope. So cartoonists, like this image from the Sun, often portrayed Britain as a sinking ship that was holed beneath the waterline. But look, here comes the ocean liner of Europe. And the idea that Britain can rebuild its economy inside Europe, that there will be more jobs, more investment, more opportunities, is another part of the message that I think was more apparent in 75 than in 2016. Now, on the day of the vote, the Sun issued a rather painful cartoon of Harold Wilson watching the results in the nude, waiting to see which way it goes so he knows which suit of clothing to put on. Now, in fact, of course, as we've seen, the result was a landslide. And Harold Wilson came out the next morning onto the steps of Number 10 and declared that the European debate was now over. Britain was irrevocably part of Europe. Why that didn't last, and why that verdict was reversed in 2016, is a question I'll leave to my colleagues. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you again for coming.
Okay, thank you very much, Rob. We're going to take contributions from the panel. I thought, given that we've just heard how you win a referendum, we might start with Andrew. How do you lose one, Andrew?
Thank you. Before working on the one I lost, I did work on one which we won, which was Scotland, and actually there's some very interesting parallels between the Scottish referendum and the EU referendum, and a very similar strategy applied to a very similar dynamic within the electorate was successful in Scotland and unsuccessful in the EU referendum, and we might want to come back to that. I worked for David Cameron in Downing Street for nearly 3 years, and I was there during the period when he decided to make the commitment to have an EU referendum. And I worked on the campaign from the beginning, and we did the whole of the campaign, was at the heart of the campaign. And I'm very happy to kind of take any questions on any aspects people might want to talk about. I think it's important to remember what was the intended kind of strategic framing, because it went wrong. It set the campaign back, I think, from the outset. In David Cameron's mind, he often used the language that he would negotiate a better deal for the UK and then campaign to remain in a reformed EU. He was very clear, we were very clear from the beginning, that campaigning to stay in the status quo was going to be quite difficult. And effectively, he was trying to triangulate. The language he often used was that some people say we should just walk away altogether. Some people say we should just settle for what we have now. That his view was we could get a better deal than that, and negotiate a deal that would be the best of both worlds, and that then we would stay in. Now that had some important consequences. It caused him to have to take a position of ostensible ambivalence until the end of the negotiations, which meant that the Prime Minister and the government couldn't properly engage in the debate wholeheartedly and make an argument until relatively near the end. It also meant that he couldn't really set out the argument that leaving the EU would be a disaster, because he'd openly flirted with leaving the EU. So it had consequences, and then I think the charge of which he's most guilty, by being over-optimistic about the renegotiations and by mismanaging the expectations of them. He famously told the Tory conference in 2014 that he wouldn't take no for an answer on free movement. When the negotiations ended in a whimper, not a bang, and we were left having effectively to argue to stay in an unreformed EU, I think that the campaign was starting from a very disadvantageous place. The work, the kind of foundational work, was done a long time before. In fact, at the beginning of 2015, when, because at that stage it didn't look likely that the Tories would win the 2015 election, the odds seemed to be that there wouldn't even be an EU referendum. But the foundation work was done in case it wouldn't, in case events kind of overtook us. So we did a very large piece of opinion research in the first 3 months of 2015, really kind of drilling down into way beyond the ostensible issue, into people's broader feelings about the EU, about the world, about a whole range of things. And what we found was that actually the underlying sort of landscape here was more challenging than I think many had assumed. There was a very wide, very deep scepticism about the European Union. There were a lot of people who were unsure and concerned about the potential risks of leaving, but saw very clearly the positive reasons why we should want to do so, which were a very strong feeling that, very widely held, that the EU costs us a fortune, and a feeling that we get out less than we put in, and that all the other countries get out more than they put in, so a feeling of unfairness. Secondly, immigration, free movement, and the effect which people perceived that was having on the country and on public services. And thirdly, a general concern about sort of mission creep and meddling and overreach, of which human rights was the most frequently cited example. So most voters were very clear what was wrong with the EU, why they weren't happy with the deal, and why we might want to leave. In focus groups, we would then say, okay, that's the downside. What are the positives about the EU? There was usually silence. It was tumbleweed, and then after a few minutes, somebody would say, well, there's the trade, isn't there? And then someone else would say, well, we could trade outside the EU. So there was a very embedded negative perception, unsurprisingly, since it's quite hard to remember many people in the previous 40 years having the inclination or the courage to make the positive case. And there was also a sort of vacuum where the positive case was. We also found a couple of really, I think, really key underlying attitudes, of which the most important, I think, was that if you ask people the question, who needs who more, most people very clearly and instantly had the reaction that they need us more than we need them. And that significantly undercut the traction and the credibility of the potential risks of leaving, because most people thought it seemed perfectly obvious that they would threaten us now and say they wouldn't do a deal. Of course they would, because they don't want us to leave. But that if we did vote to leave, that because they need us more than we need them, they would, in the end, give us a good deal. And there are a lot of people who still think that's true, which is one of the reasons why a lot of people haven't changed their view. And one of the propositions which we tracked during the course of the campaign was, if the UK does vote to leave, what do you think will happen? And there was some variation, but pretty consistently around the numbers, that the answer was, if we vote to leave, about a quarter of the electorate thought, well, we won't leave. They'll come back to us with a much better deal and we'll end up staying. About a quarter of people thought, we will leave and we won't be in the single market anymore, and we will lose most of the benefits of being in the single market. And about half of people thought, we will leave, but we'll keep the single market or something very close to it, and we'll retain most of the benefits of being in the EU, because they need us more than we need them, and in the end they'll have to give us that. I think that made it very hard to get traction in the argument that there were real risks of leaving. The immigration, which obviously was a massive issue, free movement, it became clear from the research, wasn't just because of the immigration issue itself, it was because for many voters there was a very strong read across from immigration. So another question we tracked was, would the following things be most likely to increase or decrease or stay the same if we leave the EU? And what that told us was, if we leave the EU, people think that immigration from outside the EU as well as from inside will go down a lot. But because of that, they thought, and because their perception of the implications of immigration, by a huge margin, people thought the benefit bill in the UK would go down if we leave, and NHS waiting lists will go down if we leave, and social housing waiting lists will go down if we leave, and class sizes will go down if we leave, and unemployment will go down if we leave, which will all wrapped up in people's perception of the implications of immigration on a country that felt kind of overpressed and overcrowded, which left us with a big problem, because immigration was obviously a massive motivator for people. Cameron had said, I won't take no for an answer on free movement, and then took no for an answer, had come back with what he and the people close to him in the negotiations felt was a good deal and a better deal than the other EU countries had wanted to give, and that may well be true, but anybody more than about a yard further away from it than he was, it was obviously not a satisfactory deal at all. It was a complicated proposition about the conditionality of benefits. And therefore, voting to stay in the EU meant voting to continue free movement. So the immigration debate within the campaign, between the two campaigns, was take back control of immigration completely or continue with free movement. That was an unwinnable debate from our perspective. So the only option we had, Robert talked about the sort of centrality of economics, the only option we really had as a campaign was to try to trump immigration as a salient issue with economics. And what the research said is that it wasn't innately going to be that way, but that it was potentially achievable. There was blocks of in-play voters who were potentially persuadable to vote to remain in the EU because of the economic factors, because of the economic benefits of being in and the risks of leaving, even though, if the question was about immigration and control, they would have wanted to vote to leave. And we were very clear from the beginning that if the frame of the campaign in people's minds was about control, particularly in the context of immigration, then it was going to be very, very hard to win. The big sort of substantive challenge we had on the economy is, and one can argue about, and Geezer and I have argued, and many others have argued about the veracity of 350 million a week as a precise figure, but there was an actual calculable cost of being in the EU. It was much, much harder to capture the economic benefits of being in the EU. There wasn't an equivalent single simple figure that you could repeat. There were sort of model figures. The CBI talked about £3,000 a year for an average family. People in focus groups would look at you and say, but no one's ever sent me a cheque for £3,000 from the EU. So the two obvious routes you're left with is you have a parade of experts who lecture people about how good it is for the economy. And as Michael Gove taught us, people are sick and tired of experts. Or you manufacture numbers. And so the government manufactured numbers. And most infamously, the Treasury manufactured a number, £4,550 a year, typical family would be worse off, which seemed like a sort of hysterical figure to most people in terms of the unbelievable scale of it, and also the completely implausible specificity. On the one hand, the main argument was, this is a leap into the unknown, we don't know, it's too risky. On the other hand, they could pin down to the kind of round number what the cost would be to an average family. It had no credibility. And I think what the key sort of metric for us during the campaign, we had one chart which was capturing the salience of all the different issues, 20 or 30 different factors in the campaign, and the relative remain or leave lead on them. And what it told us was at the beginning, issues like control and immigration were massive leads for the Leave side, and they remain so. At the beginning, there were a set of economic factors which were, for the voters we were targeting, potentially more salient. And through the course of the campaign, what we watched was those factors steadily moving from the Remain side to the middle, and then over into the Leave side. So a lot of the narrative, I think, at the time and since, was about the failure of the Remain campaign to tackle the issue of immigration successfully, and therefore that we lost on immigration. My view is that we lost on the ground that we fought on, which was the economy. We failed to persuade people that the benefits of the economy for people of being in were greater than those of leaving, and actually I think there was a point towards the end where the more that we went on with the campaign we were running, the more actually we persuaded people that we weren't proving our case at all, and therefore actually there was less risk perhaps and less benefit to people than was thought. The other thing which we did right at the beginning was kind of frame the structure of the campaign and the people we were targeting. We did a huge segmentation exercise which ended up splitting the electorate into 6 segments based on their attitudes to the EU, and they all silly names like segments always are. But basically what it told us was that the country split into roughly 3 roughly equal-sized chunks. There were 2 segments that were basically a vote to remain whatever happened. There were 2 that were probably going to vote to leave whatever happened, and there were 2 in the middle. And all of the focus of the campaign, all the targeted resource was on those 2 in the middle, who were defined by the feeling, and the name we gave them was hearts, feet, heads, whose starting position, who sort of upsummed what they thought was, my heart says I think we should leave, my head says I think it's too risky to leave, or it may be too risky to leave. And by the end, they started off narrowly. If you force them, voting is compulsory, you have to decide now what you're going to do. They broke in favour of Remain, and that segment at the end broke by 55-45 in favour of leaving. So we'd failed to persuade them. There was an identical group in Scotland, Hearts, Feet, Heads, who, with essentially the same campaign, focusing on risk, but clearly more persuasively communicated, who broke in favour of staying in the UK. All the way through, the private tracking said it was very close. Right, the very first piece of work we did back in March of 2015, we had a narrow Remain lead, but also a very soft Remain lead, and we were very clear right from the beginning that different turnout assumptions would flip the result. But even though we went into the final days saying it's essentially neck and neck, there was still an underlying confidence that we would win. Firstly, because we had a confidence born not least out of the experience in Scotland that undecided voters, genuinely undecided voters, if they voted, would on balance break for the status quo, which they've done in Scotland and indeed in almost literally every referendum there's ever been everywhere, and they didn't. And the second thing was the age profile of the electorate. We were confident that there would be Leave supporting voters who came out to vote in the referendum who didn't normally vote. But we were also confident that there would be a large cohort of young voters who don't normally vote coming out to vote. And that wasn't just a vain hope, it was borne out by the demographic data on the people who signed on to the electoral register in order to vote. Among those people, there was a very large skew towards people under the age of 35. The evidence is that a lot of young people went onto the register to vote in the referendum and then didn't vote in the referendum. So we went into that night thinking it's going to be close, but we're going to win. Cameron was expecting to win, though he was always very sanguine of the fact that he might not win. But the youth vote didn't happen, and the Don't Knows broke the other way, and compared with a similar dynamic in a similar campaign in Scotland, the result obviously went the other way. So my answer to the general chatting in a referendum is on the EU is, I don't know.
Well, let's ask Gisela then next. So if we just move the microphone over to her. Gisela, any comments, please?
Allow me to actually come to the book, because I found the book, every time I get offered a book to read which has anything to do with Europe or the referendum by academics, my heart sinks, and I go, it's kind of another one of those bleak-hearted liberals who's going to tell me I'm a bad person. But Robert, can I just congratulate you on really writing a great book? And you may think of me as a politician, but it's confession time. My last proper job is running the London Book Fair, and my real heart is to books. And if you don't read any book about the referendum, I think you ought to read this one. And if you don't read anything in that entire book, I recommend you read page 128 to 129, which is actually about in victory and defeat, because it looks to what I think, looking back, is the most interesting lessons to learn from this. It's that kind of political realignment. What is happening to when entrenched political parties, which are tribal, are campaigning across party politics, and can we cope with it? And the answer is no. It also kind of reminded me of a number of things. First of all, I arrived in this country in January 1974. But the thing is, because I didn't really speak English, there were a whole sort of things happening which I didn't quite understand, like why was there sugar rationing? Why couldn't I buy bread at some stage? And reading the book kind of explained a number of things to me, which kind of passed me by. So the key thing about this book is A, you read it, 2, if you only read 2 pages, read those 2, and the third one is to you, Robert, why the hell didn't you write this 3 years ago? Because I think if people had read this 3 years ago, then Cameron would not have done, which, every time I look back, I think of T.S. Eliot. Do you remember this famous line which says, we had the experience, but we missed the meaning? And I'm beginning to think back on the entire Cameron premiership as one of, that he had the experience, but he kind of missed the meaning. So he and Osborne come in and they read Blair's Journey, and they kind of think that, we're going to be the new Tories if we become New Labour. And they're going to think we can run a successful referendum campaign if we follow a whole lot of, all this stuff in here. I kind of was going, edit, change date, change names, repeat. And I love you to bits, but just from what you've said, I get no sense that you've understood why you lost this time and won last time. Something has changed out there. And I think unless we begin to understand this referendum and its significance, then these kind of dreadful divisions which are continuing, the real shock I've experienced over the last 18 months is that after the referendum, up to 23rd of June, I said to Boris and to Michael, you're the government, and I kind of foolishly believed the Prime Minister when he said, I will implement your decision. I was fast asleep on a train to Euston when he resigned. My son sent me a text message, David Cameron just decided he's going to bug off, leave a vacuum and cause a whole lot of problems. Would have been helpful if he stayed on to actually do what he said he would do. And we haven't managed to change anything. The public out there is still 30% saying, get out, I don't care what it costs. 30% still wake up in the morning and weep into their pillows. And 40% say, haven't we left yet? And the kind of challenges of both sides are afraid of looking at the future. And I think we have to start to think about tomorrow. And there were several bits about this book, Robert, which made me laugh. This is one. The other reason is because it looks at segments of it. So the way women were treated in the 70s campaign, it kind of reminded me of when Douglas Carswell decided to leave. The Essex Chronicle, the party Essex Chronicle, published a picture which had Boris Johnson, Douglas Carswell, and me in the back of the red bus. And the caption read, Douglas Carswell, Boris Johnson, and someone else. And I kind of thought, should I ever write my autobiography, I clearly has to be #someone else. And one of the things which were different about this one, and I think you're right when you had the picture up about, quite apart from the historic things, if Leave EU, led by Nigel Farage, had become the designated campaign, the referendum would have been lost. The referendum won because Vote Leave actually was a coalition of the centre in many ways. And this is why I think the realignment is going to be quite interesting. I also think the entire attitude towards supranational institutions is beginning to change. And I just want to, and I chair something, Change Britain, which was set up after the referendum to try and heal the divisions. We've been singularly unsuccessful in that project. However, to me, the most interesting research which we did was around the 2017 election. We did 2,000 interviews before and 2,000 afterwards. And whilst I could very happily explain to you why the Tories lost so badly, and why, despite the fact Labour coming almost within winning, I think it's very difficult to see where they're going to win. If you segment it to age, the under 35s are very different creatures from the rest of us. They're not tribal. They're neither left nor right in many ways. So they don't believe in the contributory principle. So they don't want to pay into their pensions because as far as they're concerned, they're going to work till they drop dead, or there isn't going to be a state pension there anyway, so why should you pay in for it? When they talk about nationalising the railway services, they're not great lefties. They just think, railway service is rubbish, it costs a lot of money, it's not delivering, so you might as well nationalise it. It can't be any worse than what you've got now. The only institution that kind of ideologically are really ready to is the NHS. And it comes down to me the result of this referendum, and I just want to make sort of kind of three observations. The one is, unless I'm very wrong, and the book reminded me again that this was the first national referendum you had. And because it was won, Parliament hadn't to face up to the fact of just what he was doing at that stage. He was utterly and completely undermining its democratic structures. It actually was infantilizing Parliament. And Parliament was prepared to ask the people when they couldn't be bothered to come up with their own answer. But they'd never worked out what they do if the people come up with an answer they hadn't expected. And I think this is our problem at the moment. How does Parliament deal with the franchise? And quite frankly, if we do not implement this, then the real big loser actually will be the democratic institutions. The second thing is that our structures and party political alliances and allegiances, I don't know what will happen. I mean, and I think Robert's case is a quite convincing one, that if this working across the parties gave people a taste for realigning themselves, I can't see that happening at the moment. But having said that, I think Scotland's very interesting, because post-Scottish independence referendum and post-EU referendum, and do remember that of the 1.6 million voters in Scotland who voted for independence, 400,000 of them voted to leave the European Union. You have a realignment between unionists and nationalists, and what happens here. So, whilst we're going through this period over the next 9 months, which are going to be really quite significant, because Article 50's 2 years deadline will come up next March, Westminster is involved in the most bizarre conversations where, because a small gaggle of people, the Lords and the Commons, are talking to each other, and they are changing their minds. They think the country out there is changing its mind. But I've just come back from Durham this morning. North of the M25, no one else is changing their mind. And if the politicians don't take the people who voted them in, take them with them, there's a problem. So the next 9 months are quite interesting. And the third element is Cameron's renegotiation, if it had been significant, would have been a recognition of Euro and non-Euro countries. He didn't even ask for it. He didn't achieve it. And I think the events in Italy, what Poland's going to do over the next few months, and Hungary, will cause a real rethinking in mainland Europe. And this may surprise you. I really regret that Cameron asked me a question to which I could not say yes. And therefore I had to say leave. And some of the consequences of that decision are very far-reaching, and history, I think, will not judge him kindly.
Thank you, Gisela. Now, Stephen, you've got to tell us your favourite page before you can start.
Well, I don't have a favourite page, although I do like the conclusion because I'm quoted in it. That's always my favourite bit. It's really my only. But no, seriously, it's a really brilliant book, and I think actually, although I am now going to talk about the referendum in 2016, I think one of the best things about it is it doesn't do that kind of popular history thing of kind of mugging at the camera going, oh, does this remind you of anything? It's just a really good, very straight history of the 1975 referendum, but in reading it, it does inevitably, I think, illuminate the present and the reasons why the 2016 referendum did not go the same way as the 1975 one. And I have 5.5 reasons why, because the kind of bit we haven't talked about at all in the book is the kind of prehistory of the European referendum, which I think to me is the kind of one of the most illuminating bits, although it is all seriously really, really good. This is the last week when I'm allowed to express any opinions about non-fiction books, because I'm about to be one of the judges of the Bailey Gifford Prize, and at that point they're going to fit a control chip in my head, which will shock me whenever I say publicly that I like a work of non-fiction. But one of the big differences is between the 30 years that Europe and the UK had in 1975 and the 30 years, but particularly the last 10 years that the EU, particularly the Eurozone, had and the United Kingdom had. In 1975, the United Kingdom was widely seen as the sick man of Europe. The six, the original founding nations of the EU, had enjoyed 3 decades of astonishing growth. The narrative around the United Kingdom was one of relative economic decline. Now, while there are many things that you can fairly criticise about the economic record of the coalition, I'm sure Gisela would have thoughts about that, and of Tony Blair-Gordon-Brown, and I'm sure Andrew would have thoughts about that. The United Kingdom had been the prize fighter of the European economies coming out of the financial crisis and in the run-up to the referendum, whereas the Eurozone, while perhaps not looking as bad as it had during the height of the Greek crisis, or as it did in parts of last week when it wasn't quite clear how the Italian crisis would resolve itself, was certainly looking a bit peaky. The other important part about the Eurozone is that one of the underlying campaign promises in the 1975 referendum was that Europe could be a device for the United Kingdom to continue its great power, aspirations and status. Now, weirdly, it was a German politician who said to a French one after Suez, don't worry about the loss of your empire, Europe will be your revenge. But in many ways, the thing that the British political elite was telling both itself and voters in 1975 was that Europe would be the United Kingdom's revenge. Now, the reality of the fact that I think it is unlikely that the United Kingdom is going to become a member of the European single currency anytime soon, although we can only hope. I'm serious, by the way. If you are not in the Eurozone, you are inevitably going to be a second-class member of the European Union on crucial issues. Now, the United Kingdom, I suspect, is going to have to accept some form of second-class status within the rule-making architecture of the European Union after Brexit anyway. But in terms of the aspirations of the British political elite and the belief that British voters have about Britain as a great country, that is going to require a considerable paring down of how the United Kingdom sees itself. And that is a reality whether or not we had voted to stay or in whatever the kind of enduring relationship with the EU turns out to be. The other big factor, my second sort of big factor was the role of business in the two campaigns. The thing that really strikes home, I think, in kind of the sections about how business asserted itself in 1975 is the way that business really was everywhere. It really was telling all of its employees, look, if this happens, bad stuff will happen. And actually that is a commonality with the 2014 Scottish referendum, in which the supermarkets did all come out a week before the referendum and go, no, seriously, it's not just the politicians saying that there will be economic consequences. There will be economic consequences. Now, partly because of the way the press covered the public polling, it is not accurate to say that the polls all got Brexit wrong. It's just that my trade, to be honest, had decided collectively that most people thought that we would stay in the European Union, and therefore polls which showed a close-run thing were written down and not talked about, and polls which confirmed the sort of media consensus that we would stay in were written up in great detail. that meant that you never got the kind of electroshock moment in which business was forced to assert itself. It's popular to say, oh, well, it didn't work in Sunderland, where Nissan, one of the few businesses to go, no, seriously, guys, don't do this. It will destroy you. But ultimately, although Sunderland did vote to leave, a lot of people in Sunderland did still also vote to stay, right? They must have done it for some reason. I do think that is one of the many things you can say that is critical of David Cameron, that he never really tried to use the office of Prime Minister to assert to business that this was a serious fight that had to be won, at least not in a way that compares to some of the, well, I think some people on the No campaign in 1975 would fairly have described as dirty tricks on the part of government ministers in behalf of the Remain campaign back in 1975. The third important factor, of course, is the role of the press. The New Statesman backed Remain in 1975, one of the few times we've supported a winning national proposition. And then again in 2016, which was a rather more familiar sensation for us as a magazine. But the media context is part of why the Remain campaign struggled to make it a fight about the economy and not a fight about immigration and other issues where it struggled to do well. Although part of that comes to my fourth point, which is again why I think the prehistory bit of this book is so illuminating, is when did the campaign to keep Britain in the European Union start? At the absolute most generous, you would probably say that it started briefly, and when did Britain in Europe start? 1998, 1999? Kind of in this brief campaign to get us into the euro, which then kind of went, oh, this isn't working. This angry Scottish man in the Treasury doesn't seem at all keen on it. Oh, well, we tried. Then went into hibernation at best until May 2015, when Ed Miliband lost the 2015 election, and a bunch of pro-Europeans went, so I guess we've got to try and keep us in the EU then. Whereas the campaign to take Britain out of the European Union, at the absolute latest, started after the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, and at the earliest started with the row about whether or not Britain should be part of the ERM in 1989. David Cameron is, again, I figure, even though he is mentioned, I think, twice, only twice more than I am, so that's a sign of how important I am, clearly. I think one of the reasons why he comes out very poorly in this book is, kind of my fifth point, the renegotiation difference. That Harold Wilson approached his renegotiation entirely through the prism of what do I need to get in order to win this referendum? What are the things that voters are bothered by, and how will my renegotiation help me win this referendum? David Cameron, and I'm sure Andrew will feel I'm being slightly unfair, but I feel that there was very much an attitude of, well, we've got to pretend to the party that maybe the EU is bad after all, and we'll have this renegotiation, and then we can have the point where we go, no, but seriously, the EU is quite good. There was nothing in that renegotiation, although there were things in terms of the British interest in the EU that were important and non-trivial, right? The permanence of its opt-out from ever closer union, some of the protections it gave to the City of London, right? There were important and valuable things in terms of Britain's economic interest in there, but there was absolutely nothing in the renegotiation that was in any way designed to fight and win the referendum in 2016. And although it is not true to say everyone in the Remain campaign believed that they would win, one of the reasons why Ed Miliband did not commit to having a referendum in 2015 is he was convinced by, among other people, Douglas Alexander, who thought that the referendum could not be won in 2014. So many people who went on to work in the referendum campaign did not believe they were in a position to go ahead and win it. But the complete fear that Remain would be defeated in 1975 simply was not as present. I'm sure you've all seen that anecdote which gets aired about David Cameron telling a European summit, we'll win by 10 points. Now, Butley David Cameron is a lot more politically successful than I, or indeed anyone connected with the NS, is ever likely to be, but I simply do not understand how anyone travelling the United Kingdom in the last decade could believe that the European project could receive a 10-point endorsement from British voters. And I do think that central question, when did the campaign start, is crucial to why the referendum was lost. and also not just in terms of how we relate to Europe, but in terms of how political change happens in general. The really important historical lesson is that ultimately you are rewarded for deciding what it is you want your political project to achieve and fighting to win that, rather than going, maybe my political project wants sensible Brexit, soft Brexit, single market Brexit, or one of the sort of 11 billion variants on a kind of defensive crouch that Remainers have got into since the referendum result. So yeah, those are kind of my 5 thoughts about it. It really is a very brilliant book. Honestly, do buy it. You can buy it and we'll sign it and everything. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. We've got time for some questions, and we should have some microphones to take questions. Before we do this, just a few words. Questions are questions. They are single sentences which end in a question mark. No one's come here to listen to your few points you wish to make. If you're the sort of person who says, ninthly, go and join the Liberal Democrats, don't come here. I'm going to take questions in batches of 3. They can be either to individuals or to the panel as a whole. I'm going to start with the woman down here. Yes, you. Yes, please. And then then I'll take the guy in the front row here. And then, because he's very close, we'll take Carl, the chap with the glasses, just behind in that row there. So short questions, please. And we're going to try and get as many in as we can. Yes, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Very interesting presentations. Who was the strategist who devised the 1975 campaign and got the balance right between appealing to heads and hearts, as opposed to those of us who campaigned the main campaign and actually at some point pointed out that we could pound the referendum on migration and took that referendum to a happy conclusion?
Brilliant. Yes, please.
This is a question for Robert. As we know, the campaign shut down on 24th of June. David Cameron's Conservatives had not planned for implementing a leave vote. Had the government in 1975 planned for implementing a no vote?
And Carl. Yeah.
Thanks. Andrew, you made the similarity between the Scotland campaign and the referendum and the risks and stuff, but when it looked like it was going wrong in Scotland, you had the vow, which was suddenly a whole load of really constitutional stuff, very positive, not really about risk. Did Cameron ever consider, when it looked like it was going wrong, I need something else? Instead, he doubled down and just wanted the economics. So I'm just wondering, was there ever a kind of consideration of, I might need to change my strategy?
Okay, brilliant. So mainly for Robert, then one for Andrew. Others can chip in if need be, but then we may take some more questions. So Robert.
Well, the question about who devised the campaign, I think, connects very well with Stephen's point about when do you start planning for a referendum. And actually, Remain started really early in the 70s. There was a recognition that the Labour government was coming and that they were probably going to have to fight either a general election or a referendum. So there's some quite careful planning early on. And it's an interesting mixture. There are some marketing figures involved. There's a lot of really, really dense and detailed opinion polling, which is used to disaggregate the electorates and to find out what do communists want from Europe, what do Christians want from Europe, and so on. But I think also at its core, the Remain campaign had a group of politicians who had fought a range of very different elections over a 30-odd year period. And I think perhaps in 2016 there were too many people who had fought the Scottish referendum and 2015, and who had a particular sense of how you win an election based on those experiences. And it was perhaps a longer bank of experience that fed in 75. Had they planned for a no vote? Lindsay Akey, who is here somewhere, knows much more about this than I do, and I think is writing about it at the moment. They had. I don't think they had planned particularly extensively, partly because fairly early on they became confident correctly that they would win, but also because although withdrawal would still have been complicated in 75, it would have been nowhere near as complicated as it is after 40 years of legal and institutional integration.
Andrew.
Yeah, that's a very specific one. My view is that the vow in Scotland didn't make any difference. And I think the point that Stephen made was much more significant. The voice of business in Scotland was incredibly powerful. And if you remember, there was a moment, the polls again, as they were in the EU referendum, were very close, and there was the memorable YouGov poll, which had the Yes campaign ahead, and a lot of business leaders who didn't want to get involved in the referendum campaign felt they had no choice, and there was a real sort of cascade of them over a period that cut through. It wasn't just the politicians saying it, these were people you had to believe. One of the consequences of that was that the vengeance of the nationalists in Scotland upon those businesses was savage and severe. Businesses got kicked off government rosters, they lost government contracts, they were warned off. And it isn't fair to say that David Cameron didn't try to use the power of the Prime Minister to get businesses on side of the referendum. He spent a lot of time personally phoning business leaders who said, you know, you better not screw this up, we better stay in the EU, but I can't do anything. Partly because of the scars of Scotland, and also because a lot of those businesses were very conscious of the fact that their workforces were a replication of the country, and therefore their workforces were probably split roughly 50-50 too, and it would be very divisive internally. The vow in Scotland was politicians panicking. The way it looked to most Scots was a bunch of English politicians have come up on a day trip from London with terror in their eyes, willing to say anything to get us to vote no to independence. Most Scots, in any case, most Scots are extremely unclear about what is always devolved power and what more devolved powers they think they might want. I think it really didn't cut through at all. I think actually, as I say, I think the impact of those businesses at the end is what did it. The answer to your question, did we consider that sort of change of gear? I think for the last month of that campaign, every single day, the core strategic premise of the campaign was relitigated in number 10, and with consideration of what to do. The only alternative thought that ever was surfaced was not, why don't we run a positive pro-EU campaign? It was, should we move on to immigration? And there was a lot of consideration of whether we should or not, and we tested umpteen different versions of what we might say, and people would literally laugh at them. Because as I said earlier, the juxtaposition of take back control over immigration versus anything else just didn't cut through with people who cared about immigration. David Cameron, I think, historically, David Cameron was a relatively Eurosceptic Tory. A lot of Eurosceptic Tories puzzled over what happened to him when the civil service got hold of him. I think that Jeremy somehow sort of brainwashed him into the central government civil service view. But David Cameron had never been a sort of evangelist for Europe. George Osborne was strongly in favour of the EU and defended a referendum. David Cameron had empathy with the people in the country who felt there needed to be a referendum. And as I said earlier, by the way he framed it, saying, I might end up having to campaign to leave unless you give us a good deal, it was very difficult for him then at the last minute to suddenly turn into an evangelist for being the EU and to really play up the risks of leaving in the way that Osborne certainly would have done.
I want to take another round of questions, but Gisela, you want to come in?
No, just a quick question to you, Andrew. Did you ever consider exercising, saying publicly that you would exercise a veto over Turkey's membership?
Yes.
And why didn't you?
We didn't because David Cameron thought it would be irresponsible. And he came very close to it. He used some language about saying that they wouldn't envision being a member in 1,000 years or something. It was a deliberately sort of hyperbolic term that was meant to capture the point, but not. His view, and it was also partly because of his relationship with Boris, and he felt Boris's use of that issue was deeply irresponsible, because Boris knew and Michael knew that there was no chance of Turkey joining the EU, and the reason why Turkey was on the pathway to join was because everybody in the West agreed that though Turkey would never actually join, having them had to subscribe to the criteria for the process of application was part of trying to keep Turkey on a path to democracy, and that it would have been regarded by Turkey as a very aggressive, hostile position to take, and of course always in the context that he was assuming he'd end up still being Prime Minister, and Britain having narrowly voted to remain. He felt it would be irresponsible to create the situation he would then have to mop up with Turkey.
Okay, let's take another batch of questions. So start with this woman over here, please. So there's 3 or 4 rows back. Then we'll take the guy in the blue. So down here, blue t-shirt, beard. Yeah. And after this woman, we'll go to the guy in the blue shirt holding the pen in his hand, please. Okay? So, yes, please.
Thank you very much for a really interesting talk. My question is about ambivalence. Harold Wilson was famously ambivalent on the question of Europe, and that worked for him. Kept his party together, and it appealed to the public. Why didn't that work for David Cameron?
Great.
My question is to Andrew. Sort of three very quick points. Three questions, sorry.
Let's have one.
Sorry, first of all, did you expect Cameron to resign afterwards, after the result of the referendum? Do you think he should have? And the main question being, what position would he be in now had he stayed in power beyond the obvious?
Well, they're close enough that you'll get away with it. Right.
Thank you. As Robert mentioned at the beginning, Ted Heath in that photo is looking more animated than usual. And there's a line in this book about him being like a meteor across the campaign, displaying a charisma that he rarely had as Prime Minister. In light of what the panelists have said tonight, I wonder if you could reflect as a group on the contribution of former Prime Ministers to both of these campaigns.
Okay. Rob, you start.
Shall I take the point about ambivalence? Yes, I think you're right that Harold Wilson in the 1980s played a really important role, which is that he had always said that he wasn't a European, that he was an Atlanticist, that his connections were in Australia and New Zealand, that he said, I don't look across the English Channel and think there's a new Jerusalem. And so his position was, I don't really like European integration, but on balance, I think it's probably worth doing. And that sort of sceptical, pro-European voice actually represented where a lot of voters sat. The difference, I think, is that he could do that because there were so many other people out there making the enthusiastic case. You know, that you had Ted Heath, you had Roy Jenkins, you had David Steele, Shirley Williams. There was a great range of genuinely enthusiastic voices, which meant that he could position himself in the middle as the sort of sceptical arbiter who listened to the case on both sides and came down for Remain. Whereas I think David Cameron possibly expected that, but then the Lib Dems were wiped out in 2015. The Labour Party elected a leadership that was at best uninterested in this question. There were very few Tory pro-Europeans under the age of 70, of high profile. So actually David Cameron had to run the campaign himself. He couldn't be that ambivalent, sceptical pivot, because he actually had to go out to the country and run the campaign himself.
Stephen.
So I think, I'm sorry, I can't read what I've written in that first one. But on the kind of on the ambivalence point, I do think largely I have to agree with all of that. I think the other kind of factor is, these are exactly right to say that one of the key moments in the second referendum was that Leave.eu, the kind of Farage-backed kind of self-evidently crazy one, did not win the nomination, and then the kind of Cameron Wilson sort of most comfortable position, which is basically to go, look at this chaos, look at these chaotic people, now look back at the adult, wouldn't you love to vote for Harold / David, right? Which actually is a political style they had throughout their careers, which worked very well for both of them, apart from in 2016 when it suddenly stopped working for Cameron in quite a catastrophic way. If you had had a more shambolic Leave campaign, I think that would have suddenly become a lot more powerful. And also, although I don't want to be one of those awful NS writers who every time someone says, why is this problem in the world gone? Well, the Iraq War. But in terms of the former Prime Minister's point, it was, to put it mildly, suboptimal than the only Prime Minister we have had since Ted Heath to be explicitly and continually vocally pro-European, had dented his popularity with an unpopular war, and then done very little to improve his reputation with many of the decisions he took after leaving office. And I say that as someone who has a great deal of time for many of the domestic achievements of Tony Blair's government. And I'm not sure if this is true, actually, because this is an opportunity for me to ask you. But one of the things that some people put about is one of the reasons why there was not a big set-piece event with every living Prime Minister saying, look, this is an awful idea. And in the end, there was that very contained Irish border thing with Blair and Major, was because Brown didn't want to do it.
That's correct.
Yeah. And that is the thing. And ultimately, although, one of the wonderful things about photos and videos from the 75 campaign is the obvious hatred steaming off Thatcher and Heath, when it came down to it, Gordon Brown could not put aside some of the divisions about what happened under New Labour. And in the end, the Labour Party looked at what happened in Scotland and decided that Brexit was a price it was willing to pay for that not to happen to them in its ex-industrial heartlands. And you can argue about whether or not it's better to have a Labour Party which has to recover for 20 years or better for us to be out with the single market in the EU in terms of social democratic objectives. But the calculation the Labour Party made, even before you get to the fact that the Labour Party had elected a leader who has the weird distinction of having voted against the creation of Article 50 by voting against the Lisbon Treaty, and then immediately went, call it, trigger it, this is amazing. But actually, although Corbyn is a problem for pro-Europeans, a much bigger problem for pro-Europeans, is that Labour's pro-Europeans were so casual about that referendum that they decided to put someone who was an avowed and honest Eurosceptic on the ballot to be their Prime Minister designate for a bit of banter. Kind of regardless of how you feel about the domestic agenda of Corbyn, right? That does show that Labour's pro-European MPs were not taking that campaign seriously enough, and that's another reason why the ambivalence didn't work, because Wilson had a backup band and David Cameron did not.
Andrew, there was a specific question to you. I mean, I don't know if you want to pick up the others as well, or just the specific, up to you.
I mean, for the ambivalence, because why didn't it work? It didn't work because it depended upon the negotiations being successful, and they weren't. In order for that to work, it had to be, wow, the status quo's really changed to justify this sort of feigned ambivalence, and him saying, actually, I'm going to campaign wholeheartedly to stay in. And it kind of rebounded because and it's not because he didn't try and he didn't try to get things which might have changed the game. It's he overestimated his ability of getting them to give him those things. Partly because he also, though I take the point about talking about a 10% win, but actually more than once he came to me and said, "Can you give me some stuff that I can show other leaders to make them believe that we might lose?" That was a factor too. On the Cameron quitting, I mean, I think it was always completely understood internally that if he lost, he would have to go straight away, that his position would be completely untenable. And he certainly felt that having campaigned wholeheartedly to remain, it would have been absurd for him to be then in charge of trying to make sense of what on earth Brexit meant, and clearly his version of what it might mean would have been as close as possible to continued membership, which was clearly not where the party was or where the country was. So I mean, if he had tried to stay on, I'm not sure that he would have lasted very long. I mean, we're already seeing playing out within the Tory party, within the government, within Parliament, how the pro-Brexit people feel about Theresa May's handling of this, and their readiness to try to blame the fact that this is being led by people who are on the other side, failing to deliver properly on Brexit. I just don't think he would have got away with it. And if we rewind, one of the reasons he ended up committing to the referendum in the first place was because his view was, if he did, the party would have taken him out and shot him anyway. Your choice was give them a referendum in controllable circumstances, or take them on and lose, was his read, maybe wrongly. I agree with the points made on former PMs. I think actually, particularly looking back on it, the moment when John Major and Tony Blair crossed the Irish border together to try to warn about the consequences on that crucial, complicated point of detail was extremely evocative and very prescient, but tellingly it didn't get any impact.
Gisela.
But I'm kind of wearing my foreigner's hat for a moment. The one thing which always struck me about the British was the total lack of respect for previous office holders. I mean, there's actually nothing more diminishing your ratings than the prefix X or former. I mean, people are interested in what you are now, but they actually don't. And I actually was found that incredibly endearing. That we kind of elect people, and when you're in office, you're in office, and when you're gone, you're gone. And therefore, I think that kind of the political weight of former office holders in terms of the public view, I think is very much overrated. But I come back to something which goes back to the first referendum and this referendum. Why are you doing this? I always remember going to a session with a rugby coach, and he said, anybody who sells you a book of saying how to win a gold medal, you don't even have to read the book, you just throw it out because it's the wrong question. The question is, how can I be better than anybody else? If you're better than anybody else, you will have won a gold medal. So similarly, if you're fighting a campaign for a purpose, if yours is better and more convincing, you will have won it. And I think Cameron went in on the kind of the wrong premise. It was history's just one thing after another. I've got to try and keep the Tory party together. Let's have a referendum, and I'm probably going to win it. And he kind of just went, the whole motivation, I couldn't work out what made that guy angry when he gets up in the morning. Other than the assumption that he'd be a rather good Prime Minister and is most likely going to win this referendum. A very specific question, I mean, had you considered, see, the thing which struck me is that, I mean, Robert, unless I misread your book, didn't Wilson work on the assumption that he had a referendum or a general election?
Yes.
So did you think through that if Cameron were to lose it, rather than, going, that's it folks, to paraphrase the previous Prime Minister and walk away, did he consider saying, if I lose it, I'll announce a leadership election and a general election to settle this, to make a general election like a second referendum?
Tell you what, let's take, because what I want to, I never believe in fighting against the lure of alcohol, but I want to take one. I'm going to take one more round of questions, very very quick questions. We can wrap the answer to that one in it. I'll take the bloke there with the blue top. Yeah, the dark-haired chap. Yeah, no, further down. Yeah, the one waving his arm as if he's in desperate need of something. And let's take the chap in the blue shirt and glasses there. I'm looking for a woman I can't see at the top. Right at the top, yes, thank you. And then we'll do right to after the blue shirt guy, we'll go to the woman in the red, I think it's red at the back. Right, sorry. So we'll run these up. Yes, quickly, go.
Right, I was going to ask the panel, how much, although there's 40 years between the two referendums, how much do you think what was said in the first referendum 40 years ago impacts upon the results of the second? And the reason I say that is there were lots of things mentioned in 1975. It's not becoming a single country, not becoming a super state, single currency, all that. It's all scare stories. And then, of course, 40 intervening years, they see that a lot of that actually wasn't true. It wasn't creating centralised state, it was monetary and all that sort of thing. And people just got to the most recent one and thought, actually, there were lots of things that were said in 1975 which were lies. It was presented in 2016 as, we're just going to stay as the European Union, well, it's not going to get more integrated and stuff. And just didn't believe it.
Okay, great. Blue shirt guy. Yes, please. Okay, shout.
I'll just shout. It's encouraging to hear how good this book is, and generally from sort of people from across the political spectrum, particularly when it came to the referendum. My question is, particularly to the politically affiliated people, do politicians have enough time today to learn lessons from history, and is there a willingness to do so?
Brilliant. And then the woman in the red there. There may not be a microphone, so you may just have to bellow, please.
Britain's had 2 referendums to remain. Once we're out, are we going to have a referendum to rejoin? Speculative question.
It is that. Right. Rob.
Okay, so on the legacy of the 75 campaign, I think I'll put a slightly different spin on it, which is that the message that was made in 75 for why you should remain was a brilliant message for 1975, which had almost completely lost its traction by the early 90s. So someone like Margaret Thatcher wants to be in the European community because it wires the free market into your political system, it wires the West together against the Soviet Union, it binds the hands of socialist governments in Britain. That's a really good offer in 1975. It's almost completely irrelevant by the time you get to the Maastricht Treaty. And one problem, I think, is that a problem for Remainers is that the Leave campaign renewed and updated its message. It rethought what its position was over time. The Remain campaign didn't, and suddenly had to start thinking about why it was in favour of membership very shortly before the referendum. On the second point, I think about the lessons learned from history. I think there is a cult of the new in politics, and it has been for many years. Tony Blair was a great one for talking about how the world had completely changed and that all the lessons of the past were irrelevant. And I mean, Andrew may tell me this is unfair, but I was on a panel shortly before the 2016 referendum with somebody who had worked alongside Harold Wilson in the 1975 campaign. And somebody said to him, "Has anyone been in touch with you to ask how you did this?" And he laughed and said, "Of course not, they're not interested in the past." And I think perhaps there was an unwise reluctance to think about what lessons there might be. And then finally, no, I don't think there's any prospect of a referendum to rejoin.
Okay, Andrew, next, if that's okay.
So, I mean, 75. I mean, the key thing about 75 influencing 2016 is when you look at the generational dimensions of the Remain and the Leave votes. Essentially, the people who voted to leave in 2016 are the same people who voted to stay in 1975. So make of that what you will. Politicians, a lot of politicians, certainly most of the politicians I have worked with, are fascinated by history and actually do try to consciously take time to certainly to read history. The extent to which they're willing and able to learn the lessons of it is down to individual politicians. Probably on the spectrum of politicians who read and follow history, David Cameron was at the lower end of the spectrum. But I don't think there will be a referendum to rejoin, not least because rejoining would mean joining the Schengen area and joining the Eurozone, and I don't think that's going to be a palatable proposition for the UK in the foreseeable future. Geese's question was, did David Cameron consider calling a general election in the event of losing the referendum? Yes, I think that thought was considered, and I think the view was taken, and I think the judgment was correct, particularly seeing how the country now feels about the referendum, that most people see referendums as sort of uber mandates that kind of trump general elections and have a greater significance of them, which is why most people feel the only way you could ever undo this would be with another referendum. And I think even if he had another general election in that circumstance, and even if he were to win it, which would be quite difficult, because the combination of events by which they won 2015 were quite hard to repeat, there would be a massive constitutional crisis. The 52% would feel profoundly robbed, and that it would be very difficult to continue in government under those circumstances anyway.
I just want to go the last one about politicians learning, and maybe misquoting H.A.P. Taylor, but I rather like my version of it, which is, it is perfectly possible to learn from the mistakes of history and make entirely new ones if you ever make them. And I think that's what the politicians engage in.
Stephen.
So in terms of the second referendum and how it was influenced by the first, I mean, actually, there was all of that stuff about federal project in the background as well. I think it's partly about, as Robert says, the Conservative, the Remain campaign in 2075 basically went, oh, thank goodness that's over, and weirdly didn't even heed the sort of massive alarm bell of Labour going into the 1983 election on a promise to take us out of the EEC without a referendum, and there was no kind of attempt to refresh that campaign. Although I think, to be honest, if you're looking at one significant event, and obviously you shouldn't, this is a terrible way to treat history, and this is why I have, a soggy 2-1 in it, and I'm the only person on the panel who's not an actor. But if you were looking for one single event, and obviously as a columnist you are always doing that, it's the 2004 accession of countries from Eastern Europe, and the failure to accompany that, particularly surprising considering we're a country with quite slutty voting rights historically, to accompany that with voting rights for EU citizens, which one is democratically, I think, suboptimal because you have taxation without representation, you have exploitation of people who've arrived in the workplace, but also, bluntly, that would fix the referendum problem in 2016 all by itself. Lessons from history. I actually think politicians, the problem is that they have the time, but they take the, sorry, I'm aware I can't remember who I'm addressing this question to, so I'm just going to look beseechingly into the, is that politicians tend to take the lessons they want to take from history. We had a general election campaign, which on the Conservative side was based on the idea that the 1983 election showed that a Labour Party led from its left flank could never win an election, which meant you could effectively have a manifesto based on an internal argument within the Conservative Party, and at the end of that, the electorate would gratefully go, oh well, I guess the Labour Party is led by Bennites, so we can't possibly ever vote for these people. And obviously that historical lesson did not work out in the way that Theresa May imagined it would. Equally, however, of course, one of the things that kept a lot of Conservative MPs from getting rid of David Cameron before 2015 was the idea that 2015 would work out in the same way 1992 did, and it did. So, yeah, kind of, you bet on history and you hope that it will work out the way it does. I'm going to make a very bold and probably very stupid prediction, which is I think, yes, absolutely, there will be another referendum on our participation in the European Union. I think unless it collapses, which I suppose is an outside possibility, but I don't think is likely, there will be some kind of supranational institution around Europe. Barring a meteor strike, we are not going to move further away from the European continent. And the trade-off between how you, as Theresa May said in her referendum speech, and actually it's a really good, it is a really good speech if you want to kind of distill the arguments about what the trade-offs about sovereignty are. You know, if you read one Theresa May speech, seriously, do read that. Is this book equivalent of Theresa May speeches?
That's the end of Rob's sale.
Yeah. But she talks about maximising sovereignty, and that trade-off is not going to go away. And at some point in the future, you know, a political party is either going to be dependent on help from a coalition partner that wants to take us back in via a referendum, or it will be reliant on its pro-European backbenchers who won't shut up and leave it alone. Which is why I think, although there are many things you can fairly criticise David Cameron for, any Conservative leader after Maastricht with a parliamentary majority was going to have a referendum at some point. And you can fairly criticise him for holding it so soon after the Scottish and Welsh elections, which meant that neither of those countries' leaderships were really ever as tooled up as they perhaps could have been to fight and win, to get a big referendum vote out of Scotland, or to perhaps get a very narrow Remain vote out of Wales. But ultimately, I don't think that those political pressures will change. I think it's very easy to imagine even a situation where, you know, Parliament collapses, you have a repeat of this Parliament, but with perhaps 10 more Labour MPs, and Jeremy Corbyn is desperately dependent on the SNP and the Lib Dems, and then of course we do have another referendum on our European membership. I think the bigger question for Remainers is whether or not they are in a position to do better in that referendum. It's not inevitable that they would do worse, but at the moment, if you replayed that referendum, partly because some of the things that the Treasury said in the run-up to the referendum campaign were not validated, and some of the things they said were simply not true. And you still have a situation in which politicians kind of go, oh, we love the single market, apart from free movement, which hopefully maybe we can get out of. So although I think that it is inevitable that we will have one, it is not inevitable that it will, then kind of this will be the return of the Jedi to the 2016 Empire Strikes Back, unless Remainers learn from the success of the Leave campaign.
Thank you for that. You should always end on a Star Wars metaphor. I'm tempted to say, in response to your question about history, that they read more history than they read political science. That's all I loved the mention early on about sugar rationing. I remember there's a story during the 1975 Conservative leadership contest where Margaret Thatcher gets into all sorts of trouble because her opponents leak a story about her, in quotes, hoarding food. And it's a really difficult story for, I always found, reading the accounts to understand. Why would someone having a well-stocked larder be a problem? Why would this possibly be a story? Until you read newspapers of the mid-70s and discover that it was impossible to buy sugar, it was impossible to buy bread. And until you do that, I don't think you can understand the referendum, I don't think you can understand Margaret Thatcher. It's all to do with the lack of sugar. No, you can't. Please look.
And the sugar was in February when the average housewife was making her jam, marmalade. And the people who wanted to make the marmalade with the Spanish. So I was this refugee here, or sort of this immigrant. I was sent out to hand over my sugar entitlement because I didn't even know how to make marmalade. So it wasn't just the sugar, it was the timing of the sugar. It was February when the Margaret Thatcher wanted to make the marmalade.
However, that was a story I wasn't expecting to hear. Outside in the foyer, there is both some severely rationed crisps and wine, and there are also copies of Rob's book. Please enjoy one, buy the other, but before you go, please thank the panel in the evening.